Hello to my Art 15 class. We're going to talk today about the chapter on color. And let's go ahead and jump right into it. There is this concept called color theory. It's something that you probably deal with on a daily basis. So we can say that every decision from the clothes selection to the home and work environment is a color choice. We can also say that the study of color is complex. You can also say that everyone can profit from the knowing of some basic color principles. Okay, so when it comes to this idea, there are certain combinations of colors that work. You can say that there are some colors that don't exactly work together. And a lot of this is very subjective. But when it comes down to color theory, it helps break down the reason why some of these combinations work and why some of these do not work. So let's find out some of these things. Let's talk about color and its surroundings. You can say that color changes, or it appears to change based on its surroundings. So if you look at this example here, there is a gray sample that is surrounded by a green side and then this pink side. You can say that the gray is making these colors feel a lot more vibrant, a lot stronger. Okay, so I wonder if you can say that the gray looks almost darker on the green opposed to it on the pink, or maybe vice versa. It almost feels like two different colors because of the surrounding colors. Okay, and now here is a concept that actually many of you already have heard about, which is the color wheel. And so some basic information about the color wheel. It was made in the 18th century by Isaac Newton. The three primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And you're probably wondering why they are primary. It is due to the fact that you can't make that color by combining other colors. You can say that green and orange and purple, they are secondary colors because they are actually a mixture of primary colors. So yellow and blue makes green, blue and red makes violet, red and yellow makes orange. Okay, so we have the primary colors, secondary colors, and we also have the tertiary colors, which is a color in between the secondary color and the primary color. So something like a red orange or a yellow green or a red violet. So those are actually tertiary colors. Okay. Sometimes you'll hear the word intermediate colors as well as tertiary colors. So it's basically the same thing. So there are three properties of color, and these are those properties: hue, value, intensity, and complementary colors. And we're going to break down these properties. So when it comes to value, we are talking about the lightness or darkness of the hue. Okay, and I'm not sure if hue is mentioned here yet, but hue is basically the color of the color that can be found on the spectrum of all the colors. So it is wherever that particular color is located on, say, the color wheel. That's what a hue is. When we talk about value, we're talking about the lightness or the darkness of that particular hue. Okay, so if we add white to a color, it suddenly becomes a tint of that color, and then with that add white, the white added into the hue, it becomes a higher value color. If you add black to a hue, it becomes a shade, and it lowers the value of that color. Okay, so you'll hear tint and shade used a lot. Sometimes when colors are too vibrant, if they are not really working for a particular color scheme that you are working on, you can always try to add a little bit of white, make it a tint of that color. And you can also do the opposite, where you can add a little bit of black to lower the intensity. And so most people can distinguish at least 40 tints and shades of any color. So there are so many different variations of a color, but for the most part, people are recognizing around 40, okay? And so normal color values differ. And what do we mean by that? When you look at a color, just the color by itself, it has a tendency to fall at a certain value, either a higher value or a lower value. You can say that a color like blue might be lower than, say, something like a orange or a yellow. Okay, and yes, it's very, you know, difficult to grasp, but at the same time, it's simple. You can, one thing that I like to do is, if I want to check these kinds of things, is I actually use my camera and I take pictures of colors and I just take out the color. I take out the saturation. And when I do that, I can see just the gray. And then if you were to do that with multiple colors, you can actually find out which colors are, or you can see where these colors place on a value scale. So you can say, you know, yellow, from high to low. You can go yellow, orange, and then maybe green, or maybe red and then green, and then blue and purple. So there's actually values in normal color as well. And don't worry if you're not getting all of this today. There's actually a whole class based off of color theory. A whole 16 to 18 weeks, and it's really intense. It's not as exciting as a regular art class, because they just focus more on color, but it's very very informative. And so we're going to talk a little bit about color properties. There is, of course, the color interaction that is happening. Just as the example we've seen earlier, colors change with their context. So the surrounding environment influences the color that we are looking at. Even though these are the same greens that we are seeing on both sides of this grid, they don't really feel like the same color because of their surroundings. The left side is surrounded by black lines, the right side is surrounded by white lines, so it feels like a different value overall. Okay, so another property of color is intensity. Intensity is the brightness of a color. At full intensity, only when pure or unmixed. So say that you have a yellow and that you want to make it as intense as possible. You just don't add any color to it. You just put yellow by itself. For those of you who have already used gouache, or even if you've used acrylic paint or even watercolor, you'll notice that a color such as yellow is so bright. Just the yellow by itself is so bright. That's as intense of a color as you can get. But once you start adding to it, then that saturation starts to drop a little bit. Okay. So when it comes to saturation, we also call it chroma. Okay. So intensity, chroma, saturation, they're all connected. They're basically how strong, how pure of that color, how pure and how bright is that original color. So there are two ways to lower the intensity. You can actually mix it with a gray, or you can mix it with a complementary color. And the example shown to us here is where on the left side, there is some blue, and then as it gradually goes to the right, there's a little bit of orange being mixed into it, so it flattens it out. So the left side is very intense, and suddenly, the second color is less intense, and then it gets very flat, and then it starts going the other direction where it starts getting more intense towards the orange side. So, you know, um, usually I ask students to experiment with this with their colors. Get blue, add a little bit of orange into it, and see how it goes. It's a really good way to flatten or to desaturate a color without taking away too much vibrancy. Because if you were to get a blue and say that you want to add a black to it, it would it would flatten out that color. But if you were to add a orange instead to try to lower the value, it keeps the vibrancy up a little bit. So, experiment with mixing. I try not to use a lot of black when I mix, actually. I try not to use a lot of white as well, unless I'm just going for highlights, and you almost always have to use white. Okay. So that, yes, again, there's so many rules and techniques that you can apply to when you are dealing with color. If anything, art is really about experimenting and finding what works. Okay. And a little bit more info on the on the color wheel. There are these cool and warm colors. Cool colors are blue, green, and violet. And some of the characteristics of these cool colors is they have this tendency to recede. In other words, they seem to be pushed back into the distance. So you'll see a lot of these cool colors in things such as sky, water, grass, or plants. Okay. We also have warm colors, warm such as red, orange, and yellow. And warm colors have this tendency to move forward, and they can represent things like fire, sun, and heat. So, um, you know, there are these rules, but do they always apply? There are so many instances where you can actually do the opposite. But when it comes to, say, the natural tendency of these colors, this is what they seem to do. Cool colors just seem to be pushing back, while warm colors seem to come forward. Okay. And they say that there is a psychological effect when it comes to these types of temperatures. Warm colors suggest a feeling of heat. Cool colors might induce a chill. So in the image here, an architect actually plays around with the warm and cool colors, which is actually really neat. If you are into interior design or architecture, they have to consider these things. They had to plan out, okay, do we want warmth in this particular space, or do we want something a little bit more cool? Because it's going to affect those who are interacting with that space. Excuse me. So more info on cool and warm colors. Let's see, here is an example where the artist progressively uses cooler blues to make the landscape feel as though it's receding even further. Okay, so the further the areas that feel further from the viewer are a lot cooler than some of these areas that are lower on the composition that feel closer to us. And because there's a little bit of the warmth of the lightness, it brings these parts forward, while there's a lot more cool colors happening in the background. Even though the overall scheme is monochromatic, there are some hints of green in this piece. So, but yes, cool and warm colors usually have these types of effects, um, receding and coming forward. Okay, so you can also think about color in terms of emphasis. There is this idea of color dominance. Areas of emphasis in a work create interest. Okay, so if they are carefully planned by the artist, the use of color by its very character commands top attention. And I'm wondering if you guys are seeing the intense yellows amongst these greens here. Even though it's very subtle, it's just enough to create a little bit more emphasis. And these examples here, it reminds me of the assignments that we did early in the semester. Okay, so I'm hoping that by now you guys are looking at this a little bit differently in terms of the effect of something as simple as color. Just the idea of using a warmer color can make the overall piece feel different. And the same thing with a cooler color. Okay, you can use color as a way to grab attention. An unusual or strong color can be used to grab attention, such as this example here and the Goldsworthy. Okay, so the yellow is quite intense, and the surrounding colors, these greens and blues, are a little bit more on the dull side. So there's a little bit of flatness, but because of the yellow in the very center, we have these two countering, these two contrasting effects happening. Okay, so you can always find ways to use color as a type of attention grabber. Okay, and there's also ways to factor in color when it comes to symmetry and asymmetry. Okay, so when it comes to asymmetry, it is based on this concept of using different elements on either side of the center axis. So we usually try not to use the same thing on two sides of an axis because it it causes less interest in the overall composition, while having a little bit of having changing elements will off center it and make it a little bit more interesting. That's the word I'm looking for, is to off center it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a better word than that. Okay. Okay. And here is an example of balance and imbalance. You can say that the upper left corner is very heavy in terms of the weight that the amount of attention. Yet on the lower right hand corner, that pattern has a lot of varying shapes and textures, or more lines and shapes. And because of that variety, it is almost enough to cause a little bit of a balance between these sections here. In other words, the upper left and the lower right. So the artist did this on purpose. I'm going to put a very saturated upper left corner, and then I'm going to do less saturation on the lower right hand side, but I'm going to diversify it by adding more different shapes and lines. So there's so many ways that artists can play around with space and color. There's no right or wrong way, but I think that when artists are aware of that, then suddenly the meaning has a little bit more to gather interest. Okay. And here we are looking at an example of atmospheric perspective. As things go back into the distance, they fade to a blue or gray. So when objects are closer to us, say that we are talking about space and we're talking about depth. We are trying to portray this true sense of depth. What we want to end up doing is to bring these objects that are closer to us. We want to let these objects have more saturation. We want them to have stronger contrast. And so we are looking at this one here, this painting by Durand Asher, Kindred Spirits, 1849. The greens and the browns are so, the greens and browns are very intense, the ones that are closer to us, while the colors start to fade as they get further into the distance. And that's what atmospheric perspective is all about. Okay, so artists can actually use color to emphasize flatness. So this is almost the opposite of the Durand painting, where the artist actually use color to create and portray a form of depth. Instead, this artist here, Milton Avery, with White Rooster 1947, actually used color to make the overall composition feel more flat. Okay, sometimes we would look at a painting like this and we say, yeah, it's so simple, it's so minimal. And one of the reasons why is that there's not enough color and value to give us depth. So it really depends on what the artist is going for. Do you want to go for more depth? Do you want to go for more realistic space? Or do you want something that is more flat? And those are different directions that you can go in terms of the use of color. Okay, so there are these color harmonies. A simple combination of particular colors based on the color wheel are also known as color schemes. Okay, so put together a few or a couple colors of your liking, and if you feel like they match somehow, then suddenly this is a type of color harmony. Okay, an example of this would be a monochromatic, basically one hue, but variations of that particular hue. Variations of the hue in blacks and whites. So if you like, black and white photography, you like achromatic, there's no chroma. You like different variations of grays. But if you like variations of one particular color, maybe you like green, you like, green added with a little bit of black, or you like green added with white, then you are thinking you're thinking more of a monochromatic scale. Okay. We also have a type of color scheme that involves more colors, such as an analogous color scheme, where you're using 2 or 3 colors right next to each other on the color wheel. So think of yellow, green, green. Say that you want to use those 3 colors. Those are right next to each other on the color wheel. And right away, it's a harmonious color choice because they're right next to each other. You could say it's an easy way to create interest in your painting or your color piece, whatever it is. Put 2 or 3 colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel, put them together on your composition, and they're automatically harmonious. Okay, so if you were to pick various colors on the color wheel, but they are not next to each other, then they might clash. Okay. So here are the 5 basic color schemes: analogous. The several hues are right next to each other on the color wheel. There are also these complementary colors where they are opposites on the color wheel. So yellow and violet are opposite of each other. Blue and orange are opposites of each other. And then there's also a split complement, which is a color where it uses the 2 colors on either side of the complement. So that's a little bit tricky, a little bit more tricky. And how can I describe that? Split complement, triadic, monochromatic. A monochromatic, let me talk about that. That was just one hue plus the shades, and we already talked about that. So split complement and triadic, that doesn't really make sense to me. So, let me show you guys. I have a little color chart here. Let's see. So I have a little color wheel here. And what's neat about this is there is already this chart that's going to tell me if it is a triad or if it's a tetrad, it's split complementary. And, I wouldn't bother with trying to memorize this. If you are into color, if you really enjoy color and you want to push color, I would get to know this. Use it every time you paint, every time you make watercolor or anything that deals with color. And so complementary are right next to each other, or sorry, they're right across from each other. But if it's a triad, you'll see that there are 3 colors that these arrows are pointing to. You'll see this triangle. So if I was to make a triad using this color scheme, let me adjust this a little bit. This is really neat, isn't it? So say that I want to make a color scheme using yellow. Okay, so I'm going to use this. Okay, I'm gonna move it there. So I'm gonna make a split complementary color scheme using yellow. So the split complementaries would be, you can see it. There's, oops. There's the complementary, but you're actually going to use these colors here: yellow, red violet, and blue violet. And yes, split complementary. They are an unusual way to make a harmonious color scheme. Okay, and let me show you another example, just so that it makes a little bit more sense with what we're talking about on the PowerPoint, because it doesn't give too much clear examples. And so let's look at triad. So there is triad here. Say you want to make a color scheme based off of a blue. And so I already have one of my arrows on blue. And if I want to make a color piece that is using this color scheme, I'm going to use blue, I'm going to use yellow, and I'm going to use red. Okay, so that is one example of a triad color scheme. Yes, are you ever going to use it? Maybe, you can try it, see how it turns out. We actually have assignments like that in the intermediate watercolor and the intermediate painting class, at least the ones that I teach. We get into that in a little bit more detail. So let's continue where we left off. So a lot of these color schemes are planned, of course. Initially, when we work with color, we just go with the colors that we are naturally seeing, such as local colors. If grass is green, we're going to make it green. If the sky is blue, we're going to make it blue. But you don't always have to do that. As an artist, you are the architect of your work. You're going to plan it out. And so many of these artists and designers, they're planning out their color schemes in advance to make a more harmonious color scheme. So in this example here, the artist is using different sets of complementary colors, and that they're right next to each other. So we call that split complementary. The orange is very visible close to the blues, and the greens are close to the reds, and so on. Okay, and now we're going to talk a little bit about color discord and vibrating colors. There are certain times where the colors seem to conflict. Okay, and in this example here, even though they are complementary colors, because of the movement, the the way the color is appearing, it's almost causing even more vibrancy to come out of this combination of colors. So the movement is adding on to this vibrancy. Okay. Okay, so a little bit more info on color use. Local color I talked about briefly. So whenever you look at an object and it is of a natural color, we call that local color. Just as I mentioned earlier, the green grass, the blue sky, and so on. Optical colors are depicting objects' color as it might be seen under various or different light. So say that you are looking at a tree, but because of the shadows on the leaves, you won't always see green. You'll see some hints of blue, you'll see some hints of purple, you'll see some 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 brown. So you're actually seeing the color of many environmental factors added onto it. Okay, so maybe sunlight, there is, you know, maybe there's clouds in the sky that's going to affect the color. Maybe there is smoke. All of these things are going to affect it, and that's what optical color is. Okay, so we also have subjective color, which is the arbitrary use of color, where the artist picks the color based on the design, aesthetic, or a more emotional response. And this is something that I'm hoping that you will experiment with in terms of your project. You know, go for something more on the subjective color side of things. You don't always have to make it local. Okay. Heightened color is the use of color that is intensified or exaggerated. Okay. Very many ways to explain one thing. Okay. Um, what else about color? It is color also produces an emotion, or it's known to produce emotion. Okay, so warm colors are usually happy or cheerful. Cool colors are usually melancholy, sometimes depressing. Okay, so Picasso's painting here, Crouching Woman, 1902, not only is the subject in this particular mood, but the color is also adding on to it. Okay, and here is another example of a pretty bold use of color. Leon Golub, Mercenaries, #4, 1980. A very interesting piece. Acrylic on linen, 10 feet by 19 feet. This is a very large painting. Something about Golub, he's a very interesting artist. I believe that he was in the Marines and that he seen many things happen in during the war in Vietnam. And so he would actually make paintings based off of his experience. And if you look at this piece, maybe we can't really see it from our perspective, but if you see the way he renders these figures, he's actually painting them using local colors, so they are in their natural colors, but he is manipulating the surface. So you can see these lines. Maybe can you guys see those lines off of the on the fabric and the skin? He's actually scraping into it so that it's taking away from some of the pigment. And when he does that, it just produces a different type of emotional reaction in terms of the way we are viewing things. Okay, not only that, but he paints the negative space in a very dark, saturated red. So what do we think about when we say, if you are painting something, then suddenly you paint red around it, where you normally would not. You'd naturally think that he's onto something, that he's thinking about something a little bit So something a little bit more symbolic. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about color symbolism. There are these conceptual qualities of color, such as the following. He is true blue. He is caught red-handed. She told a white lie. So there's a little bit of an underlying message behind some of the colors that we are using. We have a tendency to connect them to certain ideas. So color can represent a concept or idea like sin, greed, cowardice, etc. Okay. So some other examples of symbolism can be such as these, and they all really are dependent on the culture, if anything. Uh, if we think of the idea of mourning, of being sad in the U.S., say during funerals, people usually wear black, right? So in the US, they wear black as a sign of mourning, but in other countries, it might be different, such as in India, they usually wear white. And in Turkey, they wear violet. In Ethiopia, they wear brown. In Burma, they wear yellow. And they wear these for the same idea of this idea of mourning. So it really varies on the culture. Okay. And another example of that are brides. So in the US, usually brides wear white. Okay. But in Hindu culture in India, they wear yellow. But in China, they wear red. Oh yeah, I've seen that before. I've seen I've seen I've seen people. Well, I think in China they will always wear red. They always wear red. Every every holiday or every special occasion, wear red. It's lucky, the lucky color, I guess. And so royalty, of course, has some symbolic meaning. In Europe and the Egyptians, the royalty usually wear purple. In China, they wear yellow. In Rome, they wear red. Ah, so in China, they wear yellow. I thought they wore gold. Okay, anyway, those are some ideas of color symbolism. Okay. And so there is a lot of the symbolism being used in things like media. Symbolic color is associated with political, religious, and commercial messages. So the ideas that they that come to example are the green. So green usually symbolizes something like environmental awareness and and so on. Okay. And so that is all I'm going to talk about with this PowerPoint. I hope you guys learned something. Let me know if you guys have any questions.